The End of History and the Last Man by Francis Fukuyama is definitely one of those books that's far preceded by its reputation. Released in 1992, the book, or even just its title, has become kind of a shorthand for the kind of hubris in the Western world, especially the United States, in the aftermath of the Cold War, when the West found itself as atop a new unipolar world order, which would soon come crashing down in a decades-long war against terror, a resurgent Russia and China, and the rise of illiberal politics within the heart of the Western world. So in this video, I'm going to discuss what the book is actually about, what it's not about, the arguments Fukuyama uses to support his case, where a lot of his critics go wrong, and where I think there's some legitimate room for criticism.
It's an imposing title. The book is about the question of whether there exists what I would call history with a capital H.
So let's actually dive into Fukuyama's argument. What is the end of history? Contrary to what you might have heard online, it doesn't mean things will stop happening and there will only ever be peace. Nor does it mean that liberal free market capitalism is the best system ever invented and that it is much easier to imagine the end of all life on Earth than a much more modest change in capitalism. I think a fair summary of Fukuyama's argument is that liberal democracy, the system we have in the European Union, United States, Japan, Australia, is the best system of human political organization because it best satisfies our internal needs and desires. And we can look at the development of human history as a progress towards that form of government, from basic tribalism to feudalism to liberal democracy. And our definition of history really matters here, because the way Fukuyama uses it, it's not just the sum total of everything that's ever happened in human history. It's a way to look at the past in terms of a process, in terms of a progression of human systems competing against each other, all arriving at a certain goal. Fukuyama isn't the first person to do this, obviously. In the book, he points to Christianity as one system of beliefs that has a defined teleological end goal with the second coming and the final day of judgment. Marxism is another example of an ideology which sees history as a progression of competing political and economic systems, which will eventually conclude in a system of stateless communism, which will then be its version of the endpoint of history. But maybe let's take another step back. I mean, how could history even have an endpoint? It kind of depends on how you view both material history and human nature. When thinking about human nature in this sense, you do kind of have to ask yourself, like, okay, do I think that human beings have a set nature and set desires which can be satisfied optimally in some kind of way? Or maybe do you think that human beings are too diverse and too different and no one system will ever be able to satisfy everyone? Or do you think that human development and human desires are kind of random, so that at one point in history, maybe X political system is the best, but then at point Y, maybe it's a different? Do you think that human history has a kind of progress, or do you think it's ultimately cyclical or random? I think Fukuyama's argument is actually quite interesting, because he spends a large part of the book detailing one kind of mechanism that can actually push human progress forward in a linear direction, that being scientific progress, natural science and the scientific method. Because unlike art, culture, ideology, scientific progress really can go only one way. It can't just randomly change back to a previous, less developed stage without some major catastrophe. Fukuyama therefore proposes that scientific progress is one leg of a kind of forward-moving human progress towards liberal democracy. He also argues that because scientific progress is objective, if you have a technique for making one gadget one way and another person has a better method of making the same gadget, the second better method is going to win 9 times out of 10. Fukuyama also argues that the scientific method kind of forces human economic activity into the most logical system, which he would describe as a kind of capitalism. Now, I think people often overstate this a bit, that in the book he doesn't really talk that much about capitalism as such. It's mostly about liberal democracy, and when he does talk about capitalism, it's not some free market utopia. It's just a basic system of having markets, private property, selling between private ownership, stuff like that. And there's plenty of room for government intervention. But I think that's one legitimate criticism of the book, that he doesn't really specify in great detail what he exactly means by the liberal capitalist side of his theory of liberal democracy. But while the scientific method may get us towards a kind of liberal capitalist system, it doesn't necessarily get us to a liberal democratic system, because there might be a slight correlation between democratic societies and liberal capitalist societies, but it's not by definition so. You can have a system with markets that doesn't have the thorough democracy. To explain where we get democracy from, Fukuyama looks deeper within inside the human soul. Okay, bear with me because it's gonna get a little philosophical. Fukuyama argues that the human condition can kind of be divided into three parts. Well, he doesn't actually, the idea doesn't come from him, it comes from, some dead Greek guy or whatever. But the three parts are basically desire for basic survival needs like food, shelter, but also, love, passion, that kind of stuff. And then we have reason, our ability to think and make rational judgments about this or that. But then we also have Thumos, Thymos. I'm a smart guy because I pronounce it Thumos, like in the ancient Greek. And that is basically our desire for recognition, our sense of self-worth, and the degree to which we value other people. He also states that we can kind of divide this into two different forms, one being isothumia, which is viewing each other and ourselves as equal, and the other being megalothumia, which is viewing ourselves or our in-group as higher than or better than some other. Okay, that might be a lot, but okay, you signed up for this. Okay, this is a book about political philosophy. If you open up Plato, don't go asking like, why is he talking about caves and everything? But the basic concept is that people want to be recognized as people. They want to be recognized as equal beings to other people. And the history towards liberal democracy is basically a progression of unequal balances of recognition. We have a system of feudal lordship where the lord is recognized as superior to his subjects, but there's an imbalance there because the lord knows that the recognition from his inferiors isn't really full recognition. And what liberal democracy does, according to Fukuyama, is that it puts us all on the same level of recognition. We're all recognized as equal people with equal stakes in our system of government and equal rights to participate in that system of government. And that's how Fukuyama gets us, on the one hand, through the scientific method, moving towards some kind of markets-based capitalist system, and on the other hand, through our desire for mutual recognition between each other as people to a system of liberal democracy. Now, yes, I'm well aware that there's a lot to be said about this idea, whether or not you agree that, for example, some form of market-based capitalist system is the best form of human economic development. I mean, there's a lot of people disagree, but are there a lot of better alternatives right now at the moment? I mean, you're free to propose a better alternative, but then you're still kind of engaging with Fukuyama and his argument. Similarly, Thumos is kind of a nebulous concept to really work with, because on the one hand, it seems obvious that people have a desire for recognition, that people feel indignity when one person presents themselves as better than others. And especially when you blow up this relationship to, between nations, if one colonial nation feels inferior to another nation, it doesn't matter how positive that economic relationship between them might be. If one person is still the subordinate to another, if one country is still the subordinate to another, there's going to be friction there. And that's a friction that can be resolved by equal recognition in a kind of more equal liberal regime. But like I said, on the other hand, Fukuyama is quite vague in terms of what he sees as this capitalist system. Because again, it clearly doesn't mean free markets, libertarian, whatever. And there's plenty of room for government intervention in his system. But it kind of leaves you wanting to be like, okay, what exactly do you mean by this? Same with liberal democracy. He doesn't go very in-depth in terms of, what is a democracy, what counts as a full democracy, what's a thin style of democracy versus a more durable style of democracy. But on the other hand, this whole idea of Thumos and isothumia and megalothumia, it's all kind of so abstract that, when you're looking at a real world example, it's kind of tempting to ask okay, so what do I do with this practically? What do I do with this? Probably the biggest challenge Fukuyama's thesis has faced is that in the 21st century, of course, we see states like Russia, states like China, states that are quite powerful, but don't really subscribe to this liberal democratic model and are still really challenging the liberal democratic order of the West. But what makes this criticism challenging to deal with is that in his book, Fukuyama never really makes a kind of hard prediction that, oh yeah, in 20, 30 years, the whole world will be liberal democratic, everything will be ascendant, it's all going to be fine. He doesn't really do that. He just mostly makes the argument that liberal democracy is the best system, and the democratic revolutions after the Cold War throughout the 19th century are evidence of this. He's actually quite reasonable and gives a few examples of states, especially post-Soviet states, which will have more difficulty transitioning towards a liberal democratic model. And even then, the thesis Fukuyama makes in his book is kind of not disprovable empirically, because imagine a world in which 99% of states were illiberal, non-democratic, not capitalist. Fukuyama could still technically make his argument because, the things he said about scientific progress and Thumos and human recognition, liberal democracy being best for all of that could still theoretically be true. And you could make the argument, however ridiculously, that the human race is just going through a rough period in which external factors or idiosyncrasies are keeping the advance of liberal democracy back. And just you wait, in a few hundred years or whatever, we'll be back in a wave of liberal democracy. So it's kind of a theory that can't be proven or disproven, which we all know are the best kinds. I also find Fukuyama's response to a lot of obvious left-wing criticisms of his thesis very disappointing. Because, Fukuyama says that liberal democracy is the best for human flourishing because it recognizes everybody equally. But then, of course, does it though? Is a McDonald's fucking line worker equally recognized to the CEO of the company? Are employers and employees recognized equally? And that dynamic is pretty core to liberal economics, in every capitalist country that has it. Fukuyama infamously dismisses this argument, saying that, in the Western world, the class division problem has basically been solved, which is just crazy. I mean, I can think of some ways in which you can use Fukuyama's arguments to kind of say that, well, at the end of the day, class disparity might be a problem in liberal democracy, but it's not a fundamental issue. You could argue, for example, that, well, everyone still has fundamental equal economic rights in a decent liberal democratic regime. So in a fundamental sense, people are still equal. Or maybe you could argue that through unions or collective bargaining, those relationships are made equal. Or maybe you could even say that a system with a fully flat labor hierarchy where there are no bosses and no employees and everything is basically a giant worker co-op, maybe you could argue that still fits within a liberal democratic framework. But still, that would be an incredible change from the kind of liberal economic systems we have in the modern day. Would that really still fit within the same economic system that Fukuyama was praising so heavily in 1992? I kind of doubt it. Again, you could make these kind of defenses of his case, but the fact that he doesn't is probably the biggest mark against the book, in my opinion. Fukuyama actually spends a much larger part of the book engaging with what he calls the right-wing critique of his book. Basically the idea that, well, does liberal democracy really satisfy our human needs and desires, our desire for recognition? Fukuyama argues that the end of history could be a very sad time indeed. What happens to man in a world where every major battle has been fought and every social inequality has been resolved? Can we really live as a society without something greater than ourselves to struggle towards? At the end of history, we'll basically revert back to an animal-like state, having no need for higher ideological struggles, and our only purpose in life being the satisfaction of our physical needs and desires. What happens after the end of a great story, after the main conflict has been resolved? Nothing. And can we really bear to live like that? At the end of the day, I don't think you have to agree with everything Fukuyama says, but I think you have to take him and his arguments seriously, because even some of the best criticism I've read from the book are from people who clearly did try to understand what Fukuyama's point was, instead of the people who already came in with their own preconceptions about what the book says and why it was wrong. I think especially if you're someone who's concerned with the supposed decline of liberal democracy on the world, we need books like this to make the positive case for liberalism, for democracy, instead of merely attacking its enemies. Because I really think that Fukuyama was right about more things than he was wrong about. And keeping an eye on current global events, I think it's not quite the end of history.